Hello and welcome once again to this wonderful offering by nailib.com. We are dealing with Joseph Stalin's rise and his authoritarian rule in the USSR between 1929 and 1953, and this is a part of our world history topic number 10, which deals with authoritarian states in the 20th century. The last two topics seem to be remaining here. Number one, which is Stalin's foreign policy, which will be the core of this video, and the next and the last video of this section, we shall be dealing with a major sum up, major questions of historiography, and of course then we'll be looking at a sample answer as well, so that we can make this life easier for you and the journey to the Sweet 7 really easy for all of our watchers here at nailib.com. So without any further ado, let's just jump straight into Stalin's foreign policy. You've already heard at length his domestic policies and his major sufferings that he caused and the havoc that he wreaked on the Soviet people during this period of time, and you can then easily relate it with the kind of major aims of foreign policy that he's really leading out for this purpose. How much of that was met, how much of that was even important, is a question that shall of course be the larger one, that that how much, to what extent can Stalin be blamed for all of this authoritarianism. After all, he's not alone in managing all of this, something that we've dealt with at length in the end of the last video. So Stalin's prime purposes in foreign policy was to safeguard his position as a Soviet leader. So just like so basically domestic is what is leading to the foreign. All right, so domestic is the domestic focus, the domestic strength, the domestic importance is something that is leading to this entire idea of being a great, gigantic foreign leader, a global leader in that sense. Stalin had a constant fear amounting at times to paranoia that the outside world was determined to attack the USSR. So just like he had paranoia for himself individually, where he saw enemies everywhere, he thought that similarly the Soviet Union also had enemies everywhere. So they had to defend themselves, they had to always be ready for this kind of a fight. And it shall not be a common fight, it shall not be a normal fight, it shall be a fight for survival. So always the question of survival. He knew that his power at home could easily be broken if the USSR was to suffer a joint major invasion or a major defeat. So the two are very closely linked, and that is something that is very important if you are going to write a full essay, to understand this linkage between the domestic issues and the foreign issues. Consequently, compromise rather than confrontation was the guiding principle of his foreign policy, because under no circumstance he wanted the foreign affairs to play such a major role that they could wreak havoc on his own understanding and his own establishment as the leader of the Soviet Union. So compromise was his main aim. There is therefore an important distinction to be made between the theory and the practice of foreign policy under the Soviet Union under Stalin, because the Soviet foreign policy would be, in some senses, it would be very confrontational, in the sense that, we are against the capitalist world order, we are the first communist power, we need to always defend ourselves, we need to always take care of ourselves, so on and so forth. So that will always be the rhetoric, which is what is being called here the theory. You can also use the word rhetoric here, that the rhetoric will always be different from the actual implementation of that foreign policy in the real everyday business of foreign policy, which shall always be oriented towards, as the text is telling us, towards compromise and towards question of settling Stalin in for the longest possible time in the space of government and in the space of power. Just by its propaganda, the USSR was pledged to the active encouragement of a worldwide revolution. The Comintern, in fact, existed for this very purpose, the fact that, that they will be able to have a global revolution. So the rhetoric is always of global revolution. The rhetoric is always of conflict. The rhetoric is always of, we are fighting with the capitalist powers elsewhere. However, in practice, Stalin did not regard the Soviet Union as strong enough to sustain a genuinely revolutionary foreign policy, and he made his first task, therefore, for the survival of the revolution in the Soviet Union. So that became, the nationalist aspect became very important as a core of his foreign policy, that that we need to defend ourselves, we need to protect ourselves, regardless of what the rhetoric is in terms of the strength of the people and the strength of the revolution. He himself doesn't buy the lies he tells everybody else. The Comintern continued to have a role under Stalin, but it was limited to protecting the USSR. Far from being the vanguard of the international communism, the Comintern became a branch of the Soviet Ministry of Foreign Affairs. So it was a body that had been established so that revolution could spread everywhere, and people could have access to true and genuine kind of communism. But that doesn't seem to remain the aim at all anymore. The only aim seems to be propagating and pursuing the pursuit of the Soviet foreign policy. So the entire Comintern, the entire idea of an international organization that is serving the cause of communism, that gets boiled down to just being an extra force of the Soviet foreign policy office or foreign affairs office. Now, what are some of the highlights of his foreign policy then, Stalin's foreign policy between 1933 and 45? This is a very important time period because 33 is when the Great Terror is about to begin. But the purges obviously have begun in a very, very strong spate. But the Great Terror is about to begin in the domestic affair. And of course, 1945 is a very important date because that's the ending of the Second World War, which in Russia, of course, in Soviet Union, pardon me, is of course remembered as the Great Patriotic War for the Fatherland. Alright, so that's how it is remembered, because everybody was supposed to fight with patriotism for the sake of the fatherland, which is Russia. So socialism in one country is one of the great tenets of Stalin's foreign policy. Stalin conducted foreign policy in accordance with this basic principle of socialism in one country. Having defeated Trotsky in the past struggle by emphasizing that his opponents' call for the Soviet Union to lead international revolution put the nation at risk, Stalin kept to that principle and continued to harp about that principle throughout his foreign policy career, that socialism in one country is more important, which I have already mentioned in one of the previous videos. I'll just say one more line here. The fact that this was the direct antithesis of everything that Karl Marx stood for, because Marxism as an ideology is international in its very imagination. There is no way that Marxism would have accepted this kind of a logic of being spread only in one country. Then, of course, the question here is of the Nazi threat, because Nazism, as far as Adolf Hitler is concerned, we'll read about it more in the next set of videos, which are about Adolf Hitler as our second authoritarian leader. But Adolf Hitler had very clearly and concisely from the very beginning put up the idea that the end of communism, especially Soviet communism, which is Bolshevism, is his final goal. So the Nazi threat is something that has been announced from the very beginning, and it is something that is all the time all around the corner for the Soviet Union to deal with. So Stalin's defensiveness made him initially slow to understand the Nazi threat. Even after Hitler came to power in 33, Stalin tried to maintain the Treaty of Rapallo, an existing Soviet-German alliance, which was of course signed with the Weimar Republic. And now that Hitler is trying to undo it, still Stalin tries to, in a very passive way, maintain that Treaty of Rapallo. However, the following developments convinced Stalin that Nazi Germany was in fact a deadly menace that was only upcoming and oncoming, but it is never going to stop. What were they? Number one was the violent Nazi attacks on the German Communist Party. So, of course, complete decimation of any opposition. Just like Stalin had finished opposition in his own country, he was perhaps not very surprised but very confident to see that kind of destruction of the German Communist Party in Germany. Alright, the same thing that he had done to the other parties in Soviet Union, he could see another leader doing that against his Communist Party in their own land. Open talk among German diplomats of their countries expanding into the USSR as a part of the living space for Germany, which is Lebensraum. So, like, if we really want Lebensraum, Germany can extend right into the Soviet Union. Nobody should be able to stop us. And finally, the Nazi propaganda against the Soviet Union and its communism. The idea, the fact that Karl Marx was a Jew and that all of this was a Jewish conspiracy, that Bolshevism in itself is not a pure ideology and in fact is existing only so that it can be exterminated by the Nazis. That is something that was a very central part of regular and confident propaganda from the Nazi end, and that is something that perhaps awoke Stalin to this entire idea that the Nazis are going to be a menace. Soviet foreign policy until 1939 was primarily concerned with finding allies to nullify the German danger. So this is also very important to remember that for the longest time, Stalin kept searching and kept hoping that Britain and France would become his allies so that the Nazi danger which he is feeling for his country, but he is confident that others are also feeling for their country, in order to nullify that danger, he is ready to work with Britain and France. One of the fruits of joining the League of Nations in 1934 was an agreement between the USSR, France and Czechoslovakia in 1935, promising mutual assistance if one of the partners suffered a military attack. However, Europe's two most powerful states, France and Britain, were not prepared to risk war to uphold the principle of collective security. You would remember that that's the key cornerstone of the League of Nations, that if one nation is attacked, all the other nations shall collectively come together to protect it. And Britain and France are not ready to hold this guarantee anymore as the crises of the 1930s start unfolding. So that is something that Stalin is also very clear about now, that all of these alliances that they are signing, the fact that he's become a part of the League of Nations doesn't necessarily save him, at all save him in fact, from the Nazi threat. Without their participation, there was no possibility of the principle becoming a reality. So Britain and France were so central to the international politics at this point of time that no collective security would have been possible without them. Then, of course, is the arrival of the Anti-Comintern Pact. So, just like he had established, I mean, his Soviet Union has established the Comintern, which is a communist organization. He's quite surprised and taken aback when he hears about the Anti-Comintern Pact, which is very clearly an anti-communist pact which is being signed between nations of Europe. The year 1936 saw the creation of Anti-Comintern Pact formed by Germany, Italy and Japan. It carried a clear threat of two-front attack on the Soviet Union's European and East Asian borders. So if Japan is also part of it, it can attack it from the east, whereas if Europe is a part of it, I mean Germany and Italy are a part of it, they can attack from the west. So it was a double-fronted war, which is a horror dream for any nation in the world. How can you fight a war on two fronts? But the plain Stalin reacted by redoubling his efforts to obtain allies. But the plain fact was that the Soviet Union was not trusted at this point of time, because every capitalist country is afraid that the Soviet Union, if we ally with it, will ensure that then communism spreads in our country. So that is why they are not ready to be allies with the Soviet Union. And enough was known of the brutal purges to make other countries wary of making alliance with a nation where such treachery and tyranny were possible. Then, of course, comes the Munich Agreement of 1938. So you can see his paranoia mounting. The fact that when he's searching for allies, nobody is ready to be friends with him. But they are now ready to be friends with Hitler and Mussolini both. The fact that Chamberlain was ready to sign the Munich Agreement with both, in the presence of Adolf Hitler and Benito Mussolini, is something of a very rude slap for Joseph Stalin. Stalin's anxiety in foreign affairs was increased in the autumn of 1938 by the Munich Agreement, signed off by the leaders of Britain, France, Italy, and Germany. So he can see that everybody else is coming together. All the major powers are forming a group together of friendship. Hitler had demanded that the Sudetenland, an area which in 1919 had been incorporated in Czechoslovakia, be allowed to become a part of Germany. He had threatened invasion if his requirements were not met. Neither Britain nor France were prepared to resist him militarily. The Munich Agreement granted all his major demands and was conducted in September of 1938. In the Western world, the Munich Agreement was customarily seen as an act of appeasement to the German aggressor. So, in Western historiography, you can hear about this more in our paper 1 videos as well, because we've dealt with this incident at length there. But in Western historiography, it's usually seen as a very stupid kind of a last decision, last zenith of the appeasement policy, where the aggressor, Germany, was actually being appeased, going out of the way and being appeased. But that was not how Stalin interpreted it. He regarded Munich as a gathering of anti-Soviet nations in Europe, intent on giving Germany a free hand to attack a diplomatically isolated USSR. That's how Stalin interprets the Munich conference. That they are all anti-communists who have now come together, and they are in fact telling and egging on Germany that you take the lead in attacking an isolated Soviet Union. That's the kind of logic that he's applying to all these affairs which are happening in Munich in the year 1938. To counter this, Stalin then intensified his efforts once again to reach an agreement with France and Britain, because he thinks that they will reach out to him and they will understand him, but they are just not giving him any kind of credence, and they are just not allowing him to have any kind of credence in this entire conversation. And this isolation is, of course, then magnifying his paranoia as well. The fact that he is not being allowed to be friends with these major powers is very clearly going to then show him that he needs to make some efforts, or he needs to do certain things which a country or a person can only do when they are in the corner. So he is literally being cornered, and of course his paranoia is not going to help with this situation. And in the year after Munich, so that's 1939, the Soviet Foreign Ministry delivered a series of formal alliance proposals to the French and British governments. These went unanswered. That's the important highlight, that throughout 1938 and 39, Stalin's all his maneuvers, all his overtures were completely ignored by both the British and French governments. Blanked out by France and Britain in this way, Stalin then made a remarkable decision, something that he was completely, I mean, remarkable here is being used in that sense, of something that is extraordinary, something that can be highlighted, something that can be remarked. All right, and the remarkable decision is, of course, we all know that already by now, he enters into an agreement with Nazi Germany, something that nobody had thought could be possible, something that no country had thought. Forget about any other country. Perhaps Stalin himself would have not thought of it being a possibility for as few as maybe 2 or 3 years ago, is now becoming a quick reality and has now become an agreed reality by the year 1939. So the Nazi-Soviet Pact, very short-lived pact, also called the Devil's Alliance in some historiography books. It's from 1939 to 1941, so a very, very short-lived alliance. It was a 10-year non-aggression pact, but could not even survive 2 full years. In August of 1939, the impossible happened. The two deadly enemies, Nazi Germany and Soviet Union, came together in a formal pact, which we will read about even later on when we cover the topic on Hitler. Think about it in greater detail there. Do remember that the person who signed it from the side of the USSR was somebody called Molotov, who was the Commissar for Foreign Affairs, and the person who signed it from the German side, the Nazi side, was Ribbentrop, who was the German foreign minister. Therefore, this pact is also called the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact. All right, so it's one of the official names of the pact, just like it's called the Nazi-Soviet Pact. It's also called the Ribbentrop-Molotov Pact or the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact as well. As far as the Devil's Alliance, etc., is concerned, you can mention it, but do say that it's just a part of one bit of historiography. Not everybody calls it the Devil's Pact in terms of serious historical historiography. In August of 1939, the impossible happened. The two deadly enemies came together in a formal pact. Attached to the agreement was a secret additional protocol. So something that has been going on in Europe since before the First World War in 1914 is this idea of secret protocols of every treaty. So you can sign a treaty, make it public so that everybody knows that you are friends, but there'll be these secret clauses which only the two countries which are signing, they would be aware about. Not everybody in the world will know about it. And what is the secret additional protocol? In which it was agreed that the Soviet Union could make territorial and political adjustments regarding states in its western border, including Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, Finland, and parts of Poland and Romania. So a lot of territory was given to Stalin to be absolutely free about. What in later historiography is remembered as the Stalinist sphere of influence. Basically, territories of Eastern Europe, which Stalin was pretty confident that these territories belong to the Soviet Union. Just like there are territories on the western side, which Germany is pretty confident. Pardon me, there are territories on the eastern side again, which Germany is pretty confident about. Similarly, those are agreed by Stalin also as his territories and his area and sphere of influence. Now, of course, at this point of time, while he's being given the authority to go over Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, Romania, and Poland, Hitler, of course, is planning that this will not survive and eventually he will attack Stalin and take back all of this. So, right now, in 1939, Hitler is pretty fine with Stalin taking over all of this for the sake of it on the paper as an additional secret protocol. Within a month of Germany's occupying Poland in September 1939, Germany and the Soviet Union had in fact carved up Poland between them. So by October of 1939, Poland had been divided between both Germany and the Soviet Union. Shortly afterwards, the other regions were occupied and annexed as well. So Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania all fell under Stalin, except for Finland, which in fact fought for its independence very fiercely. The Nazi-Soviet Pact, of course, seemed to defy history and logic. History because the two countries had been arch enemies for the longest time, both in theory and in terms of conversations, until the very last minute, as we have seen. Stalin was very clear that he needs to make enemies against Hitler. I mean, he needs to make an alliance against Hitler, and he needs to be befriending all the enemies of Hitler. So till the very last minute, he was sending for a British and French pact, which was, of course, not happening at all. And of course, logic it is defying because everybody knows that Hitler's final aim is the end of communism. He has not made this a secret. He has not kept this a secret. It's written in his autobiography. So it completely defies logic, which is why some of the cartoons that are published as a marker of this event are pretty funny because they show Hitler as the man and Stalin as the woman who's married to him. And they then talk about this kind of wedding which will not last very long because it's a wedding that is doomed from the very beginning. And of course, all of those predictions were correct because this came true within 2 years of 1939, which is in the year 1941. All of this broke apart and all of this fell apart. So it's a decision that defies both history and logic. However, there was a rationale towards this remarkable change in Soviet foreign policy. From the Soviet end, we can understand why this was done. See, there are inexplicable parts even on the Soviet end. The fact that Stalin couldn't believe till the very last minute that Adolf Hitler is going to attack him in 1941. That's an inexplicable part. For sure, that's not something that can be explained. But this part, why he went ahead and did the agreement, can definitely be understood, at least from the Soviet perspective, because Stalin was feeling completely isolated and Stalin was thinking that every country is coming ahead and giving Germany full permission to come and attack the Soviet Union. So that paranoia plays a role, and that kind of feeling of isolation in international affairs plays a complete role in Stalin going ahead and agreeing to sign this pact with Germany. Given the real threat that Germany presented and the indifference of France and Britain to his offers of a defensive alliance, Stalin felt that he had actually not got any real alternative left. There was no actual alternative to all of this that was happening around him. He had attempted to end the danger from Germany by the only move that international circumstances still allowed, which was an alliance with Germany. So the only way to really zero in and to completely, nullify this kind of a German threat was to, of course, only befriend Germany and be friends with the German state, which is what he went ahead and did. He made an alliance with Germany. What were the results of the pact, and how did the pact, what were the kind of major consequences of the pact, and how did it change in terms of, change things in terms of the international politics? So within 2 years of the pact, the Soviet Union had in fact regained all the territories that it had lost as a result of the First World War. You would remember that Soviet Russia had in fact immediately surrendered to Germany in 1917 through the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk. So all those territories which had been lost in that treaty and during the First World War, Soviet Union quickly regains all of those treaties as a part of the protection that is being offered by the 10-year non-aggression pact, which is the Nazi-Soviet Pact. This added to the pact's 10-year guarantee of peace with Germany seemed to justify the description of it in Stalinist propaganda as a diplomatic masterstroke that had safeguarded Soviet security and thus fulfilled Stalin's chief objective in foreign policy. So how is this being sold to the people? That this is what Stalin had actually all along wanted. He did not want an alliance with Germany. He was not pressurized, or he was not at all he was not afraid of being isolated. All of this was of course not told to the people. What the people are being told is that Stalin, the great diplomat, he always knew this is the right path, and that is why he did this. And by doing this, he has managed to do a masterstroke through which he has got all the additional territories as well, thereby taking the Soviet Union to the Russian golden age of so many territories. He seemed oblivious to the fact that one of Hitler's aims was the invasion and occupation of western region of the Soviet Union. It's there as a part of his declared aims and objectives of living space and of territorialization and expansion. And of course, the main aim that he has, the life aim that Hitler has, is the destruction of communism. So while territory-wise only Soviet Union, parts of Soviet Union will be taken, the goal is to completely vanquish communism from the face of the earth. He was thus wholly unprepared for the German attack when it was launched in June 1941. Alright, he was wholly unaware of Germany's attack, therefore, when it actually happened in the summer of 1941. So the Second World War and Stalin's authority, and how did it change things? The German invasion temporarily unnerved Stalin. So that's the beginning part of it, that it completely caught him by complete surprise. You would again remember, and that's the important part about IB, that you have to link both domestic and foreign issues. You would remember that just in around 1937, as a part of the Great Terror, Stalin has purged his entire military. So when the attack comes in 1941, just 4 years later, he is caught off guard because he has no top officers. They have been purged. They have been cleansed. There has been a huge kind of, removal of their existence as far as the Soviet army is concerned. For more details, you can watch some of our previous videos, which is dedicated to this topic. But after a brief period of paralysis, he recovered himself, and over the next 4 years, he became an inspiring national leader. And of course, propaganda had a major role to play in portraying him as a very inspiring person who's standing alone and fighting against the Hitlerite domination and expansion. Furthermore, the harshness of the economic program under which the Soviet people had labored in the 1930s had prepared them, in fact, for the fearful hardships of war. So people also went along because patriotism seemed to be a better desire or need to work with, rather than all of those things that they had in fact already been suffering for a very, very long time under the Soviet pressures. So that is also something that he is very, very clear about. And that really helps the people to also, suffer the hardships of war. More importantly, the raw courage and resilience of the people proved a priceless asset in the struggle of the Great Fatherland War. That's how the war is remembered, the Great Patriotic War or the Great Fatherland War, that in fact culminated in a crushing defeat of Germany in 1945. So Germany is of course defeated, and all the people are in fact going to be ready to take credit for all of this, as Germany is defeated in that particular year of 1945. Stalin was quick to exploit the victory in order to, of course, consolidate his authority as the So, as the leader, he is ready to consolidate his authority in the USSR. At the end of the war, he gave instructions that his role in the nation's military triumph was to be emphasized. So, as I said, the fact that he is remembered as an inspired leader is a part of the immediate propaganda that started immediately after the war ended, wherein his role was absolutely magnified, and he was showcased as the ultimate leader, which which the Soviet Union was very lucky, fortunate to have. Paintings of him as the mighty war leader adorned all public buildings, even allowing for the exaggeration of propaganda. There was no doubting that Stalin had guided his nation successfully through the war, because obviously he had all the power in his hand, and he had purged the entire army just before the war, 4 years before the actual outbreak of conflict as far as Soviet Union is concerned. So there is no doubt that he was somebody who was central to all of this. It was unthinkable that there could be any serious challenge to his authority within his own country by the end of the war. It was ironic that Stalin, without ever planning it, found that the Second World War, which at its outbreak had threatened to destroy him, had ended with him having more power than ever as a Soviet leader. So his domestic dreams had absolutely come true without him even realizing it as a part of this entire Second World War. Furthermore, his grand alliance with the Western leaders elevated him to the highest rank as a world statesman. He now proceeded to use that status to further safeguard his country's interests, which were expanded by the acquisition of many areas of Eastern Europe, and that is something which is the beginning of the post Second World War, which is the beginning of the Cold War. Stalin's post-war policies then, how did he survive after the war? In its push towards westwards, the last stages of the war, the USSR had in fact wrested, which is taken away, the control of the nations of Central and Eastern Europe from Germany. So as I said, the Eastern European nations were under both Germany and, I mean, first under Germany and then under communism. So he took control. He made sure that it was his armies that took control from the Germans, and they expanded rather than the British and the French and the American armies, which were again also fighting. The French, of course, were already defeated, but the Free French armies, which were being supported from the government in exile in London. So all of that, he's ensuring that his territory, his country to those territories first, and then of course he is going to be quote unquote in charge in that sphere of influence. He then enforced his own and imposed his own authorities over them as satellites. Here, satellite means something very specific. It means a smaller state that is dependent on a larger state for economic, diplomatic, and military assistance, often in alliance. So, a satellite state is a tinier state which depends on a larger state for all of these important workings of the global order and, of course, the local order as well. Stalin refused to withdraw his armies from these areas until they had set up pro-Soviet government. So that's the beginning of the Cold War, because he has made sure that whatever he has won during this time helps him establish the pro-Soviet governments. And you can see in this map very clearly that Poland, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, Romania, Bulgaria, East Germany, all of them came under his sphere of influence, whereas Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania were already won by him as a part of the Second World War itself. So, Stalin's treatment of the satellites was in direct defiance of a joint agreement that the Grand Alliance had signed. So, Grand Alliance is, of course, US, UK, and USSR, committing them to pursue a policy of democracy, in fact, in the areas that they had occupied. But Stalin was determined to create a large buffer against any further or future German aggression, which he now equated with Western anti-communism. So, in his mind, Germany and the anger that he had against Britain and France for not supporting him earlier, they are all merged together. And to this mix, he adds US as well. So America is also added to this. And all of them are now, to his mind, becoming a huge, massive anti-communist bloc, a Western anti-communist bloc. Eastern Europe would have to pay the price for Soviet security, according to him. And even after 1945, with the Soviet Union a victorious nation and controlling a huge area of Eastern Europe as its satellites, Stalin still thought essentially defensively. So his paranoia is not decreasing. One would think that with the ending of the war, in which he's so successful, he's established as a global leader, he would become less paranoid, but not at all. Just like in the domestic space, when he had complete control of the party, the madness and the terror became worse after that. Similarly, in the foreign policy case also, when he has everything in 1945, his paranoia becomes worse after that, and Eastern Europe is the space which actually has to suffer for it. Something that, by the way, has been memorialized in Eastern Europe even till today. Something that I mentioned in one of the previous videos. If you visit any of these countries, even today, you will be going through a communist tour, a free guided tour through the city, and you would also get a Second World War tour. So there's an entire period which is remembered in a certain way by tourism even today in these Eastern European so-called satellite states. For him, defense of the Soviet Union was the guarantee of his continuing control over the nation, so that paranoia and that desire to continue in the domestic power only worsens with time. Economics then lay at the heart of Stalin's anxieties as well. Although the Soviet Union had managed to sustain itself through 4 years of total war, the strain had created a complete economic exhaustion. As well as providing a buffer, the satellites would also then be used for unscrupulously used, shamelessly used as a source of materials, like completely fleecing them of their materials so that they can contribute to the Soviet growth. Although after 1945, the USSR spoke always in terms of brotherhood of the communist states and especially of Eastern Europe, the primary purpose of the satellites was always to serve the needs of Soviet Union. It was never an alliance of equals. It was always there as a satellite state serving the needs of a larger metropolitan state. Metropolitan, of course, is a word I'm taking from the usage in colonialism. With this, we come to an end of this entire section on his foreign policy. We will continue our discussion looking at the kind of legacy that he has left behind, and of course the major debates that are around him and his existence as a part of the global affairs. And then of course we'll also look at one answer and we shall attempt it together and see how to write the important essay which is a part of our paper 2 assessment. I'm really looking forward to concluding this section with you in the next video, and I'm really looking forward to also seeing you in that conclusion. Till then, thank you so much.